Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to Reading in the Dark. Byron here. This is going to be my January wrap-up, and I'm going to dive right in. The month of January was very interesting. I sort of took part in a readathon in the first month called Years Athan, which took place between the 1st and the 7th of the month, and there were 5 challenges, and it said to complete 2 of them. Where there were 6 challenges, and the 6th challenge was to complete 2 of the challenges, so whatever. So the challenges were to read a 5-star prediction, to read a book that you meant to read in 2018, place the 12th, 19th, 20th, and 39th books from your TBR in a jar and pick one, to read a book that is being made into a movie, or to choose a resolution you think you can start or finish during the readathon. So, for my New Year's Athan, I chose House of Broken Angels by Alberto Urrea for my 5-star prediction. I chose Asymmetry or House of Broken Angels for my book I meant to read in 2018 because they both came from readathons where I didn't get to them last year. For the TBR jar challenge, I think I actually texted a friend of mine. So then he chose numbers, and then the books got thrown by tennis ball to my dog, and it was a whole thing. And that was very cute. And so then we ended up choosing Clockwork Cairo, which is an anthology of science fiction and fantasy short stories in a steampunk style set in Egypt. I chose Bird Box for my book being made into a movie, and my resolution for 2019, one of them, was to read more fantasy this year. And so the resolution that I thought I could start or finish during the readathon was to start reading a fantasy book, and that was basically indicated by my starting to read Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin, which is a prequel to the Song of Ice and Fire series. So in terms of how I did on my readathon, it went actually pretty well. I read House of Broken Angels, so I completed that, and I did not get to Asymmetry. I'm just now reading that, actually. But the second challenge to read a book you meant to read in 2018 was sort of taken care of by House of Broken Angels. And then I did read Clockwork Cairo, so that's at least 2, and if you want to count the double up, then that's 3 challenges that I succeeded on. And then the book being made into a movie was Bird Box, but I did not actually end up reading that, so I did not do that one. And then I did start reading Fire and Blood, and I got about 107 pages in the first sitting, so I think that resolution is going pretty well. So I'm going to call my participation in the New Year's Athan a success. So in terms of the going chronologically through the books that I read in January, so I had to make some room over here for covers. So the first book that I actually completed reading in January, I started a couple days before the new year, and that was The Shuddering by Ahlborn. This is a thriller which was sort of recommended to me by Instagram. Some people were Instagramming about them reading this book for something called the Shuttering read-along, because I guess this book has a lot of fans, and Books in the Freezer re-grammed what they posted. And I thought, oh, that looks interesting, and it wasn't very expensive. I don't remember how much I paid for it, but I read this on my Kindle. And I did not love this book. I gave it 2 stars. It was a very paint-by-numbers, scary things in the woods story, and I found the characters to be very trite and young and immature. I found it really ridiculous. Just like the narrator was the girl who she and her brother are hosting friends at their dad's snowy cabin, and they invited her ex-boyfriend to come because it was their last time as friends, because I guess the 3 of them always hung out together before. But now he's her ex and he's bringing his current girlfriend, and I don't know why they thought that was going to work out, but it was just lots of protracted drama and really ridiculous tropes about women and pregnancy and love triangles and whatnot, and then very quickly devolved into just survivalistness and dying and monsters in the woods. And I just thought it was really predictable and really silly, and I didn't love it. And I thought actually some of the writing was kind of bad, and so I gave it 2 stars. And that was my first book by Ahlborn that I've ever read, so that's unfortunate because I know some other people have really enjoyed some of her other books. I think one of them is called Within These Walls, and it got a pretty good review from someone that I follow, so I'm going to maybe try that one, but so far I'm not that super impressed with Ahlborn. The next book that I read for a complete 180 was The House of Broken Angels by Alberto Urrea. This book was amazing. I gave it 5 stars. This is the first book that I actually started in 2019 and finished in 2019. This book is semi-autobiographical. This is the story of a very large Mexican-American family gathering together for the final birthday of the family patriarch. whose name is Angel. They call him Big Angel. And the day before his birthday, his wife, Mama Angel, or Mama America was her name, she passes away, so then they have a funeral, and then they have the big party. And it's basically just an excuse narratively for an exploration of all of this family's history and all of the memories of this man in terms of forming his family, and the sort of some of the infighting in the family, and a lot of the, I don't know, just like heart and love and struggles and triumphs. And it was really, really moving. It was really, really just beautifully written, very funny. I love any book that kind of delves into the long history of a person and their lives and their loves and their triumphs and their, tribulations and memory and all of that kind of thing. And this book delivered that in spades, and it was really, really enjoyable. I finished this book unable to continue reading because I was crying so hard. I really love this book. It is really amazing. I think it could make an incredible movie. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I highly recommend it. I'm sure I'm not the first person that you have heard recommend this book, but if I am, then yay. But yeah, The House of Broken Angels by Luis Alberto Urrea was out, I think, in early 2018, and it's really, really beautiful. 5 stars. The next book that I finished was another 5-star read, and this is The Persian Boy by Mary Renault. Now, Mary Renault was a very renowned historical fiction writer. She was a lesbian. She lived most of her life in South Africa after moving there, and was an early member of the Black Sash movement against apartheid in South Africa. She was a really interesting and amazing woman. The Persian Boy is book 2 of her Alexander the Great trilogy. So The Persian Boy tells the story of kind of the bulk of the middle to final years of Alexander the Great during his charge across the continents, from the perspective of a eunuch from Persia named Bagoas, who is in love with him. And they're lovers, because remember, this is set back in the days when men were a lot more fluid and a lot more comfortable talking and being honest about it. And it's not actually 100% historically considered fact that Alexander the Great did lie with men, but it is considered very probable. And there are lots of references to this person, the eunuch, who was, if not sexually involved with Alexander, he was certainly close to him, and Alexander apparently very much cared for him. This is historically true, whether they were intimately involved or not. And anyway, so the book is told from his perspective, and you follow him from when he's young, and his father is murdered, and he's gelded and sold, and goes through all of these really horrible trials, and then ends up with Alexander, and then it goes all the way until the death of Alexander. And this book it was pretty long. I don't remember how many pages it was because I read it on my Kindle, but this is a gorgeous book. This book took me quite a while to read. I remember this book was recommended to me by my professor in college many years ago, and I started it, and I don't remember why I didn't finish it, because I always remember liking it, but I did not finish it back in the day. I started this way back in maybe even November, I'm not sure, but I sort of one of those books that I read a little bit of, and then read another book, and then went back to Persian Boy, and then read another book, and then read a little bit more of Persian Boy, that kind of thing. So I actually kind of plowed through the second half of this book in January and finished it on the 17th. Once again, in just rapturous tears. This book was I will never forget this book. It was so beautiful. His feelings for Alexander, and of course a lot of this is fictionalized, it is historical fiction, but his feelings for Alexander and the relationship that they had, and how just utterly devoted this character is, to read about someone so devoted to another person. It was so special. This book is one that I will read again and again and again through the years, I think, because there's so much more to learn from it. I love Mary Renault's historical fiction, but she knew so much, and it's steeped in so much fact. And of course it's mixed with fictionalized elements, but there's so much that I don't understand, that I would love to learn more about the ancient world and go back and read these again. If you're at all interested in historical fiction, and certainly if you're interested in Alexander the Great, this book is just absolutely fantastic. I adored it. All of her books are blurbed by Madeline Miller, among many other people, but there's no comparison, I think, to Mary Renault. She's just amazing. And now I've completed this trilogy, actually, because I read the third book later in the month. But I love this book so much, I gave it 5 big ol' stars, and it's worth every single one of them, and I highly recommend it. I recommend all 3 of these books in the series. The next book that I finished was actually an audiobook. I listened to Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, read by Dan Stevens. He's one of the actors from Downton Abbey, and he does a really fantastic job. I don't love Frankenstein in terms of my gothic horror. Dracula is my jam, but I like Frankenstein fine. There are sections that I like more than others. I really prefer Victor's narration. I don't necessarily enjoy the section narrated by Frankenstein's monster as much. I don't know why exactly. It just, I think Shelley goes into a lot of detail trying to explain the process by which this quote-unquote monster learns to communicate and learns language. And it's so far-fetched that I almost sort of think it's one of those things where we would have been better off if she hadn't even tried to explain it. Because every time I read that section or listen to that section, it just strains credibility to the point where I'm thinking, this is really ridiculous. And it sort of pulls me out and makes me think that, this is also implausible. Which, of course, it's implausible. It's Frankenstein. But it doesn't seem as ridiculous to me until we get to that section. So that section is not my favorite. I also just don't like really long stories within stories. They really annoy me for some reason. So I don't love that section. But I loved all of it. Or I should say I liked all of it a lot more as read by Dan Stevens in this audiobook. So I had a better experience of the novel in this format, and although the first time I read this book I think it was for Thriller-a-thon last year, I gave it 3 stars. I gave it 4 stars on the audiobook, and I really recommend this audiobook if you're interested in listening to a really good actor do a beautiful job of narrating a classic work like this. This is and it's not that long, this is a really beautifully produced audiobook. There was only one instance of a line that was randomly repeated where he was like, he was saying something like, and then she went outside. And then she went outside. And then continues, and you could tell it's just like 2 different takes of the same line, and that was kind of funny. But that's a tiny, tiny little thing. Not even a nitpick. That's just like something that I noticed. Anyway, it's a really beautifully produced audiobook, and I highly recommend it. It's really fantastic. So that was 4-star listen for Frankenstein. The next book that I read was Clockwork Cairo. This was an anthology of Egyptian steampunk, and this was sort of like all over the place. There were a lot of stories in this, and I'm not going to go into specifics about the stories. There was some repetitiveness in this collection. Egyptian steampunk is kind of a drilled down genre. So we're getting kind of specific at that point. And there's lots of there's like a heist vibe and like an ancient things coming to life vibe. And then there's some sort of parables in here. There was a really interesting story about a man who is supposed to be creating the crypt for a dying pharaoh who wants him to create a body that he will be able to inhabit in the afterlife because he's crippled in real life. It was a beautiful story about these women who are bringing this steampunk copper scarab thing to life. And that story was actually written by a friend of mine, Kay Tempest Bradford. And I think the story is actually called The Copper Scarab. There were I would say 4 or 5 stories in this book that I really, really loved. And then there were only a couple of stories that I really disliked. For the most part, this was really, really fun. And I enjoyed the Egyptian vibe of it. There's also definitely like a sort kind of a Victorian, Britishy, steampunky, sort of Sherlock Holmes era type vibe to all of these stories, which was really fun. And I gave the collection 3 stars. I have a very detailed review on my Goodreads that goes story by story, and they all have a star rating, but I'm not going to go through all of it right now. I will say this was really, really fun. You can find this on the Kindle store. I also had a really good time reading it while I had some YouTube ASMR video of ancient pyramids and a sandstorm coming through and stuff. That was sort of fun. I've become addicted to ASMR videos while I read, unfortunately. Let's see. And then the next book that I read, because I wasn't feeling well and I just needed some comfort, was a cozy mystery. So I have finally knocked one item off of my 2019 Book Riot #ReadHarderReading Challenge. which was to read a cozy mystery. And this was a Murder, She Wrote book, The Ghost and Mrs Fletcher by Jessica Fletcher and Donald Bain and Renee Paley-Bain, who I believe is his wife. Donald Bain is the guy who wrote all of the Murder, She Wrote novels, and there are 44 of them. This is book 44. I got this in hardcover, and I don't know, I guess I'm being like judgmental to say this, but I guess I never even considered that these Murder, She Wrote books were available in hardcover. But yeah, so there are quite a few of them available in hardcover, and this was a really adorable story. This combined all of these elements, if you've ever watched Murder, She Wrote, that I really enjoy, which is that it's set in the, coastal Maine seaside town of Cabot Cove, which is where she's from. It includes all of these like classic characters from the TV show, the Dr. Hazlitt and, the Sheriff Metzger and Eve Simpson, who's like a real estate agent. And in this book, Eve Simpson is tasked with selling an old house after this man passes away. But the house is said to be haunted, etc., etc. And there's an issue where the man had all of these books, and his house was just filled with bookcases everywhere, and they were just covered in books, but the books weren't in any order, because after he finished reading a book, he would always just put it anywhere on the shelf. And they have to figure out what to do with the books instead of throwing them away so they can raise money for the library. And it's just everything about this book, that just the whole vibe was just cozy and adorable and fun and sweet. And I didn't think too hard about trying to predict anything, so I didn't well, I guess that's not true. I guessed a couple of the plot points, but it did not detract from my enjoyment of the novel at all, because I wasn't feeling well, and I needed to just immerse myself in this sweet little small town mystery, and it delivered on every aspect of that. And it turns out one of the reasons that this novel, number 44, contains all of these really classic elements of Murder, She Wrote, is that this is the last novel that Donald Bain wrote before he passed away, I think in October of last year, which is very sad. That I finally am now reading books in this series and he has passed away. But he wrote, I think, if not all of them, most of them. So he's written so many of these novels, and this is the last one he wrote, so I guess that might explain why just all of the most chestnutty, cozy elements of this genre all came together for this one book. And I really, really enjoyed it, and I sort of rate things based on the genre they're in and what they promise to deliver. I'm not comparing this book to House of Broken Angels. I'm just thinking about what I expected from this book, and in that regard, I give this book 4 stars. I would probably have given it 5 stars if I hadn't been able to guess the ending. But as I said, I really enjoyed it anyway, so it was just a really solid, cozy mystery. Really, really fun, especially if you like Murder, She Wrote, and that was 4 stars. The next book that I finished was the final book in Mary Renault's Alexander the Great trilogy, which is called Funeral Games. This is the shortest of the 3 books, and this is told from multiple perspectives, and it's basically all about all of the maneuvering that happens after Alexander's death, who's going to be king, and all the different sort of suits for power that took place in the vacuum of his leadership after he died. And Bagoas from the second book is in this book, and that was a surprise to me, and I sort of was so happy to see him again. I didn't realize he was going to be in this book, so that made me really happy. And again, I won't go on too much more about Mary Renault. I just love her writing. I love the way she depicts the ancient world. This was a beautiful book. It was shocking. There were things that happened that I was not expecting, and I cried, and I think I even laughed. I just really, really love Mary Renault and this whole series, and I gave this book 4 stars. It was a little bit more plot oriented, I think, than the second book, and I would say that overall, I'm going to do a whole video about this series, but the second book is my favorite, and I like this one. The first one I read so long ago I can't even really remember, but this is book 3 in the series, Funeral Games by Mary Renault, and it was highly entertaining. And honestly, you don't need to read them in, I would recommend reading them in order, but you could read, if you're just going to read one of them, you could read any of the 3. So I really enjoyed this book, and I gave it 4 stars. The final book that I read was actually a short story, almost novelette, I guess, called The Autobiography of a Traitor and a Half Savage by Alix E. Harrow. And this is a story that I found on Tor.com, which was really interesting. It tells the story of a Native American woman who works as a map maker for these, European imported American settler people who are trying to, create the maps of the new world so that it will be easier for people to settle and whatnot. And it was really interesting read. I went on Tor.com, which is mostly science fiction and fantasy. I searched historical fiction, and there weren't that many. And this was the first one that came up, so I read it. This story starts off by saying that she's a map maker and she's a traitor to her people because it's the map maker's job to hold the land still. And there was this sort of personified the land in America as being this living thing that's constantly in motion, and the native people can navigate it with no problem. And as it moves around them, they understand where to go and everything, but that the white settlers don't understand it and they get lost all the time, and it's been causing all these problems. And so they hire these guides, these Native American guides, to help them hold it still while they map it, and then the land will stick to one sort of design. And for the longest time while I was reading this, I thought that was just like a really beautiful metaphor for the fact that they knew the land better and the white people did not. And it wasn't until about halfway through that I realized this was sort of magical realism, alternate history situation going on, where they literally were saying, Alix Harrow was literally saying that the land moves, because what happens at the end made that very, very clear. So it went from being really, really good to being great, because I realized, oh, wow, that's a really, really cool idea. It was beautifully written. There was a lot of harrowing, suffering that this character endures, but I loved the historical aspect of it, and I thought it was really, really beautiful. This author has a new book, a novel coming out in September of 2019 called 10,000 Doors of January, I believe, and I am automatically going to possibly pre-order and buy that book just because I fell in love with this author just from this one story. It's really, really great. If you have a chance, you can read this for free on Tor.com. Again, it's called The Autobiography of a Traitor and a Half Savage by Alix E. Harrow, and I gave this book, or this story, 4 stars, and I'm kind of lingering on that and thinking about upping it to 5, because I really, really don't know how it could have been any better. But I really, really, really enjoyed that story, and I highly recommend this author. They have more short stories available, I believe, on the internet that I haven't read, and in other collections that I want to check out. And actually, as soon as I finished reading this, I loved it so much. I felt bad having read it for free, so I went on the Kindle website and purchased the ebook edition of the short story for $1 just to support the author and just to have it because I was such a fan of this story. So those were my reads in January. It was a really good month of reading for me. I read 8 things, and I'm on track for my goal for reading 100 books in 2019, which is kind of crazy. I'm noticing with this challenge, I definitely have to keep up my pace, because every time I have a couple of days where I don't read, I check my Goodreads and it says, you're 1 book behind. So it's definitely going to be something that I'm going to have to work hard to keep up with, but I think it's doable, and so far I'm feeling good about it as I head into February. And so those are my reads in January. It was a really good reading month. I guess I had a 2-star, 5, 5, 4, 3, 4, 4, 4. So I kind of want to say that without actually doing the math, that feels like a pretty good average rating for the month. And if I don't count the Shuddering, it's a very good rating for the month. So it was a great reading month for me. I had a great time, and I thank you all for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions about the books that I read, or if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. Appreciate you guys coming and spending this time with me as we talk about bookish things. And until next time, I will be here in the dark reading. Bye, guys.